Hello everyone, today we talk again about the Slavs, Bulgars and Avars, a topic that you particularly appreciate, apparently, from the views. Every once in a while it's important to also go a bit above as a visual and look a bit more comprehensively at the picture, in fact, of these peoples, their timeline, their spaces as well. There is one video that I made years ago at this point that completely sucks. It's much worse than these ones that people keep watching. It's the most watched entirely, algorithmically speaking. There are always, thousands of people watching it, and I'm surprised by that. And I think the reason being the topic is something like Slavars, Bulgars, Magyars, and Slavs, something like that. This goes close to it, so maybe it will cite that for some reason. And I realize that these topics may be, let's say, not necessarily people are more interested in that are less discussed on the internet. And as you know, I also create this chapeau on them, for which I talk mostly around the perspective rather than the hardcore of the historical facts, whatever this term means. Historical facts that are pretty much still the same. Like, it's not that medieval history has suddenly changed, that for some reason somebody came up with a new evidence that changes all the paradigm or whatever. Paradigm, I don't know even you pronounce it in English, doesn't matter. What matters is that you keep clicking on this, and for some reason I appreciate that I'm not using it as a clickbait, but because, as you know, and you can evidently see, I discussed the thing for a long time, but because, again, I think that if this is really what you're interested in, it's a positive thing because you're interested in history in the first place. I have some perplexity when I see that maybe some other topics are completely bypassed, but they are arguably also more important, and in some cases way more important. But this is exactly the same vehicle I can use to deliver other content later on. So it's great. As you know, sharing is probably the best thing ever. I don't care about donations. If you have to donate, pay some of those weird sites that give you views or something, like give views to the channel, something like that, or properly share, which is for free. I mean, it does have a cost, but it's still way more effective. And I understand also, say, at least I'm personally interested, and also as a historian, to always understand the reason behind these interests, etc. So I try also to address the topic in a fashion that maybe touches on that curiosity, but also, again, putting things in perspective, because I think that's always the best way. If you don't put things in perspective, historical topics are monodimensional or bidimensional. You don't appreciate them in all their depth and complexity. So recently we made videos about the Slavs, and in the past we also talked about the Bulgars and the Bulgarians. So we will keep talking about them soon, I can tell you, because I'm intention to look a bit more thoroughly into the Balkans, which we haven't discussed very much. And again, I think that's instead a very underrated in general in popular culture and even in historiography, because I see that there is less about that historical topic, and also because I haven't covered these topics yet. So we have just recently seen yesterday with the origins of the Serbs and the hypothesis revolving around them, let's say, how complex in some ways not much the Slavic ethnogenesis per se, but the interaction of the Slavs and other peoples is, and how important, however, is for the same modern identities. And we look at countries that are essentially stemming from different dominations, which seems here to be the leitmotif for the Slavic migrations in general. Think about the Avars and the Magyars. right? Today's Hungary is importantly Slavic in ethnic background, but of course from a in properly genetic background in a way, but of course it doesn't even, it's a country that doesn't even speak Slavic, right? But an Ukrainic language. Differently, Bulgaria, that bears the name of, just like Hungary, of the former dominators, that were also kind of akin ethnically, at least if we talk about the Avars, rather the Magyars, in fact Ukrainic, but still this Turkic background. Is a Slavic country entirely. People speak the Slavic language, and that's fundamentally the identity of the former rulers was diluted. Maybe with Hungary there was also greater continuity with peoples of more different linguistic background that somewhat left really sedimented analogian trace. If you think about the Huns, the Avars, the Magyars, etc., for the locals to lose essentially a European language, and to, albeit being fundamentally European overwhelmingly by descent. So for other peoples, as we've seen, this may have happened a bit in the same way. We find, for example, the Romanians today speaking a Romance language, and we still haven't fundamentally clarified how that happened. Why Romania, that is, after all, not the closest country to in the region, Central Europe with the Balkans in the south, to the spring of Latin language, and where that modern Romance derives, to speak that way. But so it is. We made a video about that, by the way, and we will probably keep coming back on that. We've seen yesterday how the Serbs, the Croats, were possibly, probably Slavic, since probably at the time of the settlement in northwestern Balkans, probably mixed importantly, and this we know for every people with other peoples, but in that case perhaps they had been hegemonized politically by peoples that were not of Slavic origin, but perhaps of Iranian one, etc. And one of you has asked me in the comments how it is that, by the way, such, given the pre-existing languages to the Slavic settlement, how was it possible that eventually the local countries were largely Slavicized and began to speak Slav, right? Because if there was a pre-existing majority, I could even make a question and answer video there, and I'm thinking about it. In fact, but I could easily answer now. Also, they would have been absorbed like other peoples, ethno-linguistically, let's say, by the pre-existing population. Well, as we've seen, I was talking about this in the video about the Slavic migration to the Balkans, that in some of those areas is kind of the majority, the ones where in fact the Slavic language is spoken today. The genetic studies seem to have hinted at a very substantial Slavic minority, and even parity at some point of 40-50%. In those conditions, it's really different from, say, Germanic migrations that were just bringing in a few points percentage to the millions of the former Roman provinces, were really much more densely populated. The Balkan, the Danubian area, doesn't matter how developed in certain areas indeed was, right? And the question was made relatively to Serbia specifically. Well, they were still different. Consider, first of all, that Serbia, as we were saying yesterday, today occupies a territory that stretches much east than it was at the beginning of the settlement. Serbia was shifted dramatically towards the Dinaric Alps. It faced the Adriatic, as a matter of fact. It occupied some certain areas around today is also Bosnia, Montenegro, and Macedonia. So was a complex thing. Eventually, the modern country took shape, kind of shifting northeast in a sense, towards the plains, right? And what is important there is to notice, first of all, we don't know exactly at any historical time, especially in the early Middle Ages, what was the exact percentage of speakers, etc. But if we talk about a normal 40-50%, and we realize that the most developed areas were mostly hegemonized by some powers that in fact were not Slavic, because the Slavs, as we've seen and we'll keep seeing today, were basically and mostly under some other domination. Could be Avar, could be Byzantine, could be Bulgar also. Let's say the city doesn't represent the majority, right? It's the countryside that represents the majority from a demic point of view. So even though there was some infrastructural say continuity with older times, with some more advanced areas that kind of surely were more culturally resistant in terms of, say, I don't know, Romance or Greek, especially the latter, the southern you go. Modern Serbian, still as a Slavic language, has very interesting Romance elements in it, right? Because consider that the area of the Danube Valley properly was also in the Balkans, north of the say of the mountains to the river, was more Romance influenced than Greek influenced. Greek influence was from the Aegean watershed right across the mountains, whereas again countries like the Illyricum and in fact the Mesia, etc., Pannonia, were much more properly Latinized, right? And so that also maybe hints at the fact of why Romania is the way it is, but that's another issue that is more complicated than that. So given that proportion of speakers, let's say if somebody arrives and finds a situation that is also fragmented, by the way, because these areas were overall in the region were a sum of different elements, right? There had been historically the Traco-Illyrians, the Celts, which are very much overlooked. Essentially Serbia, today's Serbia, roughly around Sinjidunum, etc. Those were Celtic peoples. These Kordiski that were also quite warlike, and the Romans took a lot of time and effort and losses to dislodge from there, but some remained eventually. Then there were these Sarmatians that were roaming around, especially between the Danube and Dacia, that corridor between Pannonia and Dacia. Then there were the Germans that also moved in pretty large numbers. You know, the Ostrogoths, the Longobards were some of the largest, but were actually the largest coalitions of the migration era. Together with them, there were lots of other peoples, right? Celts, Romanized populations, Turks. The Huns, as we've seen, were there. The Avars later were there. The Magyars were there. So just imagine how dramatically, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to bring to a let's say to ethnic fragmentation per se, right? But how many peoples had properly followed one another as at least as rulers in the area. And the point of the Balkans that instead are, especially also if you look at countries like, especially from on the left bank of the Danube, so actually Central Europe, not really the Balkans properly meant. So some books talk about the Balkans including, I don't know, the history in fact of Hungary or Romania, but that depends on the convention, right? It's not a big deal because the Balkans doesn't mean much. It means the mountains in Turk. So that's where the name comes from. But and it's proper, in fact, the narrower boundary there. But went importantly depopulated in late antiquity. So we don't have many figures, again, demographically to say, okay, we know exactly what was the percentage of the Slavs who settled, because we don't even have an actual archaeological traceability of the Slavic settlement. We know there were people there, probably some of them came from somewhere else, but we can't, again, tag who was who on the base of a material culture was importantly homogeneous. right? Even though we see that there were connections with, I don't know, the Prague culture, with ones also of the Dniester River and so on. In fact, most of which Slavs probably came from, they eventually settled in the Balkans between the 6th and the 7th century. But those areas had, these historiographers are quite clear about that, were frontier areas. They would essentially grow further as frontier areas in the Middle Ages and thus go depopulated. As certain areas, say, I don't know, Castile during the Reconquista, right? And in fact, if you look at peoples like the Serbs, they weren't really, as I was saying before, dwelling in the flatlands like they mostly do today, because eventually of broader, the civilizational progress, etc. These were ferocious mountaineers entrenched in their, in this pretty austere reliefs and forests, etc. And their, let's say, ethno-national compaction probably derives also in that properly hardcore Slavic dimension, in spite of eventually what we see most of these peoples today. You do find the Slavs, you do find taller people, some even northern Pontic types, but the majority are dark, they're kind of Mediterranean. So as for other peoples, even the language that you eventually speak later can be, first of all, the process of a later and also more recent, like modern contemporary linguistic hegemonization, and especially in the Balkans this is kind of evident. Also in generally speaking, also in Central Eastern Europe before the 19th to 20th century, where there was a dramatic ethno-nationalist recompaction, for not speaking about ethnic cleansing and genocide, that completely redrew the ethnic map in many areas, right? So creating also certain mythologies and political issues that do not really help, as we were saying yesterday, to really, even from these countries, to have a crystalline objective, say, view of the world. But that's another issue, and there is a lot of work being done that should be appreciated instead exactly in these places. To the struggle that meet with a resistance when also something more sound wants to be affirmed. But that properly back in the day already, the presence of the Slavs was important. In fact, because it doesn't seem that the Slavs were really many in absolute terms, but there were many in relative terms. That is, the local populace probably had dramatically decreased, and the Slavs also brought together with them a political model and a cultural model that was, in a sense, better fitting the necessity of these communities. This is something that we find also in the West with the Germans, right? There were countries like, I don't know, Italy, that were completely Germanized from a cultural point of view. People spoke Romance, but politically and institutionally, they thought they were Germans, because legally they were considered as such. Why did this happen? This happened because of, in a sense, a refusal of the Byzantine, centralistic, fiscalistic, and autocratic model that also kind of, in fact, dramatically shrank exactly in these areas. We study the Balkans, Italy, and so on. And that, from the other side, by its own existence and attempts of reconquest, catalyzed, favored, engineered, indirectly, a new identity that was used as in opposition to the one of the others. So I'm not saying that this was the main reason that was rationalized or we can trace it easily, but let's say the idea of becoming Slavic at that point meant to be something else, right, as opposed to the empire, which again, especially in the Balkans, this is difficult to say because by a certain degree, of course, these peoples were within the empire, but it was for political convenience because they had to find an ally. This is especially true, paradoxically, in the countries that were more distant from Constantinople, like Croatia or Serbia, because in that instance, it was much more important, say, to side with the Byzantines that ending up under, respectively, I don't know, the Franks or the Avars or the Magyars, right? So at that point, it would kind of buy more into the Byzantine pack. Whereas if you look paradoxically at the Bulgars, eventually Bulgarians, who were literally next door to Constantinople, well, this maintained another identity, because even though they, yes, somewhat believed to partake the empire in a way, they thought they were it was their empire, was something that they had taken from the Romans and substituted themselves to as such, right? A bit like the Germans did in the West with the Renovatio Imperii, right? Because it was literally the idea that this universal power was now smiling from God to the better ones, right? And the Slavs, just for the fact that they call themselves glorious, really exemplified this process. It was true also for the Bulgars, and even their Turkic Khanate kind of style of power that, however, also was much more quickly absorbed by the Slavic culture, as saying before. But think about the Avars, right? That power believed to be an ecumenic empire, right? Everybody fundamentally believed that, even the smallest tribes. I mean, why do you think the Slavs called themselves like that? Because ideally, that was the aim of any people. So such identities are really important, because after all, they do show that you can change identity, that these identities are fluid, are mobile, they can adapt to a certain narrative agenda and contingency. And of course, also, the Slavic languages differ. And there have been, again, later historical influences in these countries, etc., that also change things in the meanwhile. So, but for the migration era, it's not so surprising why eventually Slavic was essentially the language that eventually, by also praxis, if the majority remains as a... The previous populations were scattered, were mixed, were part of this kind of multicultural Byzantine blend. The Slavs were kind of more compact, provided with this kind of more seducing idea, at least, of being something else entrenched in the mountains to resist this other dominations. And so, independently from the international game, the rest of the people adapted because found a more compact, systematized, we could say, and effective political and cultural model that helped, where of course the previous populations were just something else. And never underestimate mindset as well, right? Some peoples properly within the Roman Empire had historically become kind of subjects, right? They had lost as colonists and read serfs that kind of aptitude to political and military activity, for example. When the Slavs arrived, they caused literally also in there, of course, a few had remained, but exactly in this sense, they helped washing away the fragile structures of the empire that would contract brutally. And in fact, the Balkan hinterland, albeit namely under Constantinople, would never quite be like in antiquity, where literally there was an empire with frontiers and garrisons and etc. Even in late antiquity, this had been the point, right? But in the early empire, there was properly an eternal heir. It was Roman, right? Doesn't matter how, especially in the Balkans, some peoples had remained. Think about the so-called Illyrian emperors, how warlike they had kind of remained. This is present even in Anatolia with the Isaurians. It was absolutely normal. The Roman Empire didn't homogenize forcibly or for some specific reason. It was kind of a vassalatic system where everybody had their own place under Roman power, right? So while some identities were preserved, still the idea that somebody could be free, right, was not, let's say, was present, but had been lost in practice, right? So that's why the Ostrogoths want to free the Italic peasantry during the war against the Byzantines, because they tell them, look, we're fighting for another way of life. And in a sense, at that point, the Ostrogoths would have actually maintained that way of life because they liked all those large estates and the multitude of serfs under them, but the war had destroyed them, right? And so And if this was true for Italy during the Gothic War, it surely was pretty destructive, but the Balkans had arguably suffered much worse. So the Slavic impact was easier because the lands were depopulated, had fallen much more dramatically. I mean, there is no comparison of the infrastructural reality of the Balkans or the Danubian Valley and in a country like Italy, for example. So that tells you, like, if in Italy it was possible to switch identity into a Germanic one, you can imagine how easy it was for the Balkan population to switch to a Slavic one. And again, let's not underestimate how many elements, of course, of the pre-existing population lived on, also in the Slavic identity and cultures and tradition. After all, peoples in Europe were not that different among each other, and probably in the basic lifestyle. So this linguistically Indo-European family of the Slavic peoples, as we know, had been formed way before the Vulgar era, right, with this likely origin in the regions north and northeast of the Carpathian Mountains, so roughly in today's southeastern Poland and Ukraine, the Pripyat, so-called Pripyat marshes, or not actually many marshes actually, but that where the Slavs had coalesced as a separated identity of some sort that probably we overlook historically because we don't know essentially much about. We know that the Slavs interacted importantly also with the Baltic people, and this had, where in some instances those areas had been even more advanced than parts of Germany, right? They also were close to the Black Sea, to the Sarmato-Atlantic dimension. They bordered all around, mostly with the Germanic populations in the northwest, the Celtic and the Illyrian ones in the southwest, the Thracian ones in the Carpathians, Iranians in the southeast with Sarmatians, previously the Scythians, etc., and Finnic and Baltic in the northeast, and gradually they begin to spread, right, in the first centuries AD, right, in especially a southeastern direction. This is also overlooked because mostly in those centuries we talk about the Germans, right, because these had created the larger groups, confederacies that managed, as a matter of fact, to cross compactly exactly those eras, rising up the valleys of the Elbe and Vistula rivers, and eventually arriving from the other watershed on the Dnieper and the Dniester. Think about the Ostrogoths, the so-called Ostrogoths that established this pirate kingdom properly in areas of today's Ukraine, in Crimea, and in fact there were Gothic traces, Germanic traces, possibly, but we don't know exactly whether of that time's origin, but we're pretty close to the ancient, what we know about the ancient Gothic, up to, anthropologists documented them in those places still in the 18th, in the 19th century. Then, as you know, Crimea and other surrounding lands were brutally engineered by deportations during, especially Stalinian times, etc. But there were a lot of people there. There were historically the Tartars, also the Slavs, there were some Greeks, there were these Germanic elements, there were the Genoese communities. So this was actually normal for European standards up to, in fact, just a few centuries, even a century almost, well, at this time ago. We are already after World War I, but in fact, some permanence had maintained also for some other decades after that. But as you know, we shattered the old world. But as I was saying, these initial Slavic or early Slavic or Proto-Slavic, whatever I'm going to call it, movement is somewhat overlooked because we know that this block of peoples that probably also stood there while the other ones were crossing their territories in a way, or also joined, and that's why also they moved southeast, were kind of moving on their own, were kind of starting to roam around to test the boundaries, the frontiers, etc. It also, in fact, joined other peoples. When the Huns came to shatter for almost 1 century the Germanic world, and in part dominating it, in part orienting it towards the west, the Slavic expansion also began to modify its principal direction, as it accentuated its orientation towards the northeast up to the upper Volga, and in the west also it went to gradually occupy up to the Elbe River the territories abandoned by the Germans that had largely migrated, right? And it developed eventually also southwards up to and beyond the middle and low Danube in the territories of the Eastern Roman Empire, right? Also here, we are mostly documented about the Germans. We know much less about the Slavs. And again, part of the reason is that in the Roman radar, the Germans were the bigger coalitions. And also, ethnographically, there was a bit of synecdoche there by saying these are Germans. But as we've seen, it's not before the 6th century that we have an actual Germanic source saying, okay, we are the Germans and separated from the others. Notoriously, the ethnogenesis of this people was extremely multicultural. There was a kind of core, right, of early, in fact, Germanic origin that was remaining because of essentially the political compaction that it provided. These peoples were very driven, very warlike, and they had, just for the fact that they emerged, evidently hegemonized their neighbors and absorbed them and transformed them into Germans, right? When we speak about, about the Vandals. In part, we can speak of Slavo-Germanic peoples. When we talk about the Longobards, we think about Sarmato-Germanic peoples, right? In part, it's an excessive assessment because, first of all, again, we have no idea what their actual composition was ethnically, right? From a genetic point of view, you can't really trace that, right, for the peoples of the time. It's fundamentally impossible. So we have to rely mostly on just the broader evidence that we have in the movements of these peoples. And again, that's even somewhat more complex because, again, the core can't be seen. But all the peoples that they were absorbed by them, especially the ones that were fleeing from the Huns and reversed themselves en masse in these peoples, were probably absorbed in where the hell, we don't know where they came from. But we can't see it because, if a Longobard, say, Arimanus of the 6th century archaeologically looks like, a Hunnic cavalryman, well, with a type of armor that you find from Pannonia to the Bering Strait, well, you start understanding that these were properly, and even properly, they were horse, stepped peoples. Maybe it's too much, because again, it's not a matter of, of demic consistency. It's a matter of cultural imitation. In fact, I always come up with the Longobards because I mostly studied them back in the day. And there, if you actually follow the Longobard migration and you actually you study the information we have available about their neighbors and the migrations, there is actually zero evidence that there were, these peoples were, not largely and mostly and overwhelmingly Germanic in character. Yeah, sure, they received influences, but how do we trace them? Archaeologically? Well, archaeology just gives us some info essentially about their equipment, their material culture, right? And genetically, we have a very few, again, evidence of dramatic divergence from some, essentially the local regional ethnic pools that are also kind of similar among each other. So what actually matters are the forms of representation that are also, incidentally, the ones of the elite, because the richest stuff, the best burials, etc., are also one of the richest people who could bury more and show off more. And so, in that sense, those were, as always, as elites, the most international element of the, say, international in the sense they were imitating the international elites than the rest of the people. So we have made some times of this idea of multicultural, multi-ethnic dimension of the migration era and the late antiquity, like the paradigm from which you cannot really shift. But if you study these peoples per se, you don't really have at least any proof that that was the case. Like it was obvious that there were other elements of different peoples within them, but you never, let's say, you never have the quantity of saying, this were, I don't know, a 40%. There is no evidence of that, right? And consider this, that there were fewer people at the time, and that the political bonds were kind of very important, so that even just think about the same Slavic migrations. They went to occupy areas that had been left depopulated by others. Even in those times, unless there were these kind of dramatic upheavals like the Hunnic invasion, etc., and even in that case, it's not that people would just literally flee entirely, assuming that they would literally pick up the tents and abandon completely the land without any trace almost. Most people, considering that these were mostly all still agricultural, even if their mindset were semi-nomadic, because they could think to live on the run, or even just on a short range they would be habituated to move for, I don't know, the transhumance, for some, pastoral needs, etc. But mostly would actually remain there, right? And this is the case mostly of the Slavs. We don't have any proof they moved much, right? It began rather to expand, also finding, again, when finding space that had been left empty by other peoples. The fact that they had been left empty, what does it mean really? It means that even though, as we just said, there was always somebody inhabiting there, the most elite elements of this right had the means to provide for a broader migration. So this is kind of the example of the Germans, right? Why did the Goths, for example, move en masse when the Huns arrived? Because hell, they were habituated to rule, and they didn't want to, to risk annihilation when, they could find like space elsewhere. But we know that the Goths are also the best example, because a part of them remained under the Huns and also had a very important role under Attila, in fact, and even had the strength to rebel to his successor later. And a part instead entered the Roman Empire also violently and managed to remain a reality there, and also actually a quite cooperative one with the Romans, contrarily to the idea of these were barbarians who wanted to destroy them. No, actually the Visigoths had an enormous they respect and they revered enormously Roman authorities, because they knew what they could get from them, right? This is showed by, especially Visigothic history is incredible. The Visigoths paid a massive tribute of blood for the Romans. They were always trying to settle the matter for a, just give us land and we will settle there. We will give soldiers in exchange. We will make the deal. And it's rather the Romans that kind of took advantage of them, right? Alaric made an incredibly orderly and peaceful loot of Rome after Honorius had literally exterminated their own women and children, because they feared Roman divine power. And they implored the Romans not to let them loot the city, because they said, let's find a compromise. And in the process, of course, they were not gentle souls either, but let's say, again, these mechanisms show you how politically compact, in a way, they were in the expectation of some future for the people. So these are not really avalanches of people that are, just like prairie dogs that run en masse to drown in the large North American rivers. These were real polities that were making, in spite of all the instability that they had within them, because they were not states, they were not even monarchies exactly by that point, but they still understood exactly for that the importance of compaction. The Slavs seemingly didn't have much of this, because they were, in a sense, the ones that had inhabited the least developed areas in many ways. That, for this reason, also came late in the migration era mechanism, and that probably didn't have much of an elite, of a hierarchy, of a properly of a structure to oppose to, especially these ever more, in fact, autocratic, hierarchized, and warlike peoples. Right? The Huns, for example, were ridiculous compared, I don't know, to the Avars. The Avars were really something, man. Especially, again, even there for reasons of political compaction. Initially, they weren't like that. They arrived all in scattered clans. They weren't really fearful. But when they were compact, damn, the same Byzantines said that they were the best of the barbarians, militarily wise. And they were. They had all a technique, a zootechnic capacity, and a equestrian culture that was really very advanced, and also obsidianal capacities. They probably didn't quite learn in the Balkans, but they had only, at least against the same Byzantines, but probably had some, Middle Eastern, even Eastern Asian influence on. The others are credited with having introduced not just the stirrup in Europe, but the Chinese trebuchet, that, however, was kind of just in the air at the time. Technologies traveled very fast, telling the truth. But, it seems that the Byzantines acquired from the Avars these stirrups and also other military gear, such as even, the pavilion types for the camp. The Byzantines are quite eloquent about that. But, a massive influence on the military hardware through the Balkans, and not through, say, the eastern frontier with the Persians, that were also a hell of an equestrian culture. So the Central Asian dimension brought by these, in fact, Turkic peoples, they were starting in the 6th, 7th century, being really also very advanced. The steps advanced civilizationally themselves over the years, the military technologies, etc. We could make a video explaining this gradual passage. And the Slavs at that point were coping, in fact, with forces that were beyond their means to kind of contain. They had, in part, an advantage. Exactly the wildness and roughness of their land prevented conquerors to really settle there. And in Central and Eastern Europe, especially, the area of the forest was never quite fully permeated by nomadic peoples. Like, they could launch raids, the others would do, even in some core areas of Europe, like Merovingian Germany, etc. But, say, the Slavs would always be able to entrench in their forests, in these swamps, and up to later times, even when the Mongols invaded the Rus, they could, yes, they could create, vassals and tributaries in the forested north, but couldn't quite venture themselves, at their own risk. But heavy cavalry, it is habituated to operate in the steppe, in the forest. It's something very risky, and in fact, they also suffered their share of setbacks. And so the Slavs had this capacity of expanding, exactly, in fact, in areas paradoxically were, yes, safer, but kind of less developed. And however, even among them, because it's not that they were intrinsically different from, the Germans, etc. Actually, their genetics was probably also very close to that. Their culture was very close to that. The Slavs we know today are the product of an important differentiation as well, right? And they, the most enterprising ones, thought, in fact, to move south. Where did all these peoples during the migration era want to move? In the wasteland? They wanted to migrate towards the Mediterranean. That's where the riches, the populace, the advancement, the opportunities really were. the possibilities properly for the elite to rule on larger amounts of people, to structure kind of statal realities, right? So for the Slavs, as we've seen, in this terrible storm that was keeping arriving from the east, like from a Western European perspective, basically, yes, we have the last migrations, we have the Longobards, it's over. Just literally across the Alps, in the Pannonian Plain, this thing went on for centuries. Not only were some Bulgars that were at least settled, received the permission also by the same Longobards in Italy, in central Italy at some point, for example. There were this Avar raids, as we've seen, up to Merovingian Germany. We probably underestimate how permeable, even in a sense, the Scandinavian peninsula was, or at least how strong the influence of the steppe was on the north. There are panoplies in Sweden that are definitely one of Turkic peoples, and some say that probably even Scandinavia was brought, at least namely, under the Hunnic domination at some point. And of course, this meaning in practice that not that the Huns came there to rule, but say that it was a minimal cooperation or tribute or something, just because the Huns were otherwise pressuring these areas in ways that didn't necessarily even have to be direct military threat. I mean, Attila probably never thought to even send any expedition to Scandinavia. Again, the only possible objective was the Mediterranean. But these other peoples around had limited possibilities as well. And so that's what I think historiographically we have not been habituated to realize. In fact, there is a paradoxical dimension, that is to say that the most advanced peoples, say, pick the Greeks, the Romans, naturally we have their own perspective because they wrote, because they factually tell us the story. And aside from the ethno-nationalistic paranoia of some children today that are obsessed that, I don't know, that the terrible Romans stole the memory of their glorious civilization that existed somewhere, but we have no idea. We should be extremely thankful that there was something like, I don't know, a Roman Empire that did what it did for us to even know anything about these peoples. But what we tend to not realize is how, in this sense, how impacting culturally the Roman Empire was at the time for those peoples, and how the Romans actually didn't give a damn about them in some way. Again, why is that we don't know about Central, Northern, Eastern Europe in detail in the time? Because the Romans didn't care. And they didn't care, of course, because what was present there was objectively less relevant. But what is fascinating here, again, is not to restore who knows which, third millennium civilization existed there. The Romans couldn't subjugate or things like this. What is fascinating there is that those peoples instead knew a lot about Rome. Again, the Romans didn't even know that, geographically speaking, say, the modern lands of Russia existed, right? But we have Roman artifacts up to the Urals, right? So those people knew what was going on around, and this is in fact, the precluded, especially steppes perspective, that when you realize that the steppes peoples moved back and forth across thousands and thousands of kilometers in this longitudinal stripe of Eurasia, they did it because they knew. They did it reflecting, but they knew about the sedentary populations, because those were the cows that they hoped at least to milk. Of course, they were not the stronger of the sides, and factually, the history of these peoples, and also the more sedentary ones that came south, is the absorption of those peoples by the local civilizations. But they wanted, and they could, and they would exploit possible internal crises that were also kind of more structural, not necessarily created, at least by them specifically, from a political point of view. So the Slavs as well would try to do that, would try to exploit, especially the Eastern Roman frontier instability, the same Avar presence. Now, sometimes literally fighting at the side or under the Avars, that, as we've seen, also shepherded literally Slavic migration in southeastern Europe, but also against the Avars. We were talking about it the other day, just with the Croatians and the Croats and the Serbs that seemingly were settled by Heraclius in the first half of the 7th century, crossing literally the Turkey, that is what the Avars were called, like, from Central Europe, literally passing through that land to settle eventually in the Byzantine Empire, was at war with the Avars. Probably those Slavs migrated there alone. But again, the fact that it was probably an anti-Avar function there shows that, in fact, not just they could migrate alone, because they had the potential of doing it, but also they had the cohesion and the lucidity of saying, okay, let's go through this perilous, journey, because maybe the Avar Khaganate was turned into turmoil. They also fought each other constantly, so they could exploit that weakness. But in this sense, they must have had some political compaction that, and in fact cohesion, that also was reflected in a sort of military relevance that is probably also highlighted by the fact that, I don't know, we talk about the Croats and the Serbians till today, while most Slavic tribes that settle in the Balkans instead, we don't even know their names because they eventually were absorbed by somebody else, including the Byzantine Empire, by the way, as you know, because many Slavs settled far south up to the Peloponnese, etc. Some were even deported to Anatolia. Some probably crossed the Mediterranean, arrived even to North Africa. So this latter aspect, let's say, of the political compaction is relevant because when you look at these waves of conquerors from the steppes, or more or less since the Bronze Age, what you actually realize, even from the mythologies of these people, is that the strongest peoples were the ones that could in fact go more south. That the true winners, conquerors, were not the ones who remained north, were ones that managed to conquer the richest places in the south, and because they had more power. Right? If you study, for example, the Hellenic mythology, well, there you find the most radically hardcore Indo-European idea of crystalline perfection and inalterability, that those conquerors, exactly because probably they were the ones who scored the biggest hit among by settling in Greece, that was already advanced at the time with Indo-European migrations, thought themselves of. Probably they also conferred to the Greeks that kind of crystalline, kind of inalterable idea of perfection of themselves that they also kind of paid for against the Romans, or later on as the Byzantines against, this other world of the Westerners, of the Turks, etc., that was tearing them apart. Because again, they were kind of the most exalted, right? The same in a way is what happened in Italy with the Italics, with the Latins. This probably, we don't even know what their names were because they took the name of the local places. But as Indo-Europeans managed to trigger this, the Roman conquest of the world that cannot objectively be explained, but if I made several videos of this, through the radically self-confident and superiorly aware attitude of the fact that the Romans were the God-chosen people that had to take over the world. Right? So this megalopsychia, we could call it, is indeed a trace of the peoples who make it, right? So history, it hasn't been told to you like that because it sounds disturbing by a certain degree, but this is factually and possibly the only true and sensible and correct approach that you can have to explaining something, rather than saying, we don't really know why it happened, right? It's not a materialistic, deterministic, structuralistic thing, right? It's people wanting things and doing them, right? Coming up with them and deciding to do them and being resisted enough to carry that out successfully. So that's how the Slavs from their point of view, also acted. Again, the term Slava is the universal glory of the sky, of the military, etc. So, as we were saying, this is the phase where properly the Western, the Eastern, and the Southern Slavs distinguish themselves. To the Upper Volga they arrive, citing the Finnic peoples in the north, and other populations from the steppe, and developing eventually what would evolve later on in the Rus, etc. The Western Slavs up to the Elbe, right, in areas that were probably hardcore Germanic for centuries and more, and that now were depopulated sensibly, and the Slavs kind of permeated them. And in the south, across the Danube, in the Balkans. So this also makes you understand, however, that at the threshold of the Middle Ages, the Slavic peoples were still pretty much unstable politically. Again, we don't really have, aside from these tribes, much of another, like a statal reality. There were some important centers that would start profiling themselves already during the 6th century. For example, there is a very important continuity, probably with had been the former, at least in part, Ostrogothic rule on the Black Sea at the time of Justinian, that were the Ante, that dwelt essentially on the banks of the Dniester, the Dnieper River, that also are equated to the so-called Penkova, Dniester-Dnieper, Penkova culture. Also the so-called Prague culture, that essentially is the basin from which the so-called Kingdom of Samos, we will see now briefly, and also the so-called Great Moravia would emerge, and later properly, like the Przemyslid domination in Bohemia, etc. So you see, there are groups, by the way, Sukhov in the area of Pomerania, Mogila in the area of essentially where the Poland would have emerged. So these are very gradually, I mean, the local dominations at that point were something like some clanic clusters that would revolve around a prince of some sort, hill forts, some kind of primitive market development around the fact the stocks were sedimented in this fortified rings, and in fact the start of what we see later also as important Slavic states that exist to this day. But it was a long way to go. Again, what I often remark in my videos is to consider the fact that we sometimes, especially as far as the Middle Ages is concerned, if anything, for the same name, like the Middle Age, as if there was another age before, another age later, so we're in between, and so there's no reason to think so much in depth of the origins and the ends. But consider that the ancient world had literally been the beginning of what we call, at least as a civilization. That is to say, before, there hadn't been traceably anything like that, and at least these people surely didn't leave because on the wake of a pre-existing power. So what it means banally, even the fact that, I don't know, the continental plains of Central Europe are cold, and for agriculture that is a big deal, right? The production system was very fragile, very poor. The crop rates were ridiculous. A person could work and kill themselves on the fields, and at the end of their lives, not even realizing they had managed to increase sensibly their possessions, right, through the surplus, if they hadn't been slaughtered by somebody in the meanwhile if I hadn't died of plague or simply starved to death because one of the harvests, in fact, had failed. But again, it was a very hard work that gradually coalesced this dominations. Now, the Slavs, as we've seen, they were not nomadic. The term nomadic can have different range of meanings, right? Semi-nomadic, stressing the fact at least that they could ideally be on the move if the necessity was there, is okay, but they were agricultural, right? Just like the Germans. They, of course, had livestock, they hunted, they fished, they looted, too, because again, in the very fierce struggles between these clans and tribes, sometimes you didn't really have a chance. There was a deep warlikeness of these people. Again, when they began to border, I don't know, the Franks, or even to say Byzantines in a way in the Balkans, what emerges from the Slavs is that they were atrociously fanatic, bloodthirsty defenders. You couldn't dislodge them from wherever they were, because they would fight to the death, and there was properly no political and social or military convenience or capacity in dislodging them from there, because the lands they inhabited were just like the Romans with the Germans back in the day, right? You could even there was it was important to tame them, it was important to control them, it was important to kind of cooperating with them, and on the long run, on the Elbe, especially the Eastern Franks and the Western Slavs began to really work together. It was a great process, as you know, assimilation of the cultural intersection. It lives also to this day, in spite of all, the 20th century, etc. But again, it was a very long work. I made a video, incidentally, that received some view. It was, I don't know, I think last month, about the defense of Europe during the second invasions. If you wait, yes, the defense of Western Christendom, the centrality of the Magyar-Slavic frontier between the 9th and the 10th century. Because, by the way, the Magyars at that point were also doing the same things the Avars had done before against the Byzantines. Like, they were invading Germany by bringing together with them all these Western Slavs that periodically also raided them when they didn't obey, right? And interestingly enough, paradoxically, those smaller Slavic communities would be more resilient on the long run than this same, systems, at least until the Avars were destroyed by the Carolingians. The Magyars suffered their very heavy blow, but at least in their case, they stabilized, they settled down for good. But also, in fact, there was a periphery, there was a frontier around the Pannonian domination that the Slavs remained always distinguished from. And again, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, this is not necessarily because there were the Slavs from one side and Magyars from another. They were kind of blended, right? But culturally, in their lifestyle, it was obvious that, I don't know, living in the center of the Hungarian plain still meant that investing culturally on the idea of the raider of the steppe, the overlord of the steppe that exacted tribe, it had this kind of military lifestyle that was supportable because of the pastors in the area, etc., to subjugate the other peoples around in a equestrian fashion would be more like ethno-nationally more seducing, let's say, than instead what the Slavs in the Sudeten or in Serbia thought, that they were well entrenched in their mountains and forests and would resist, again, fanatically at any kind of interference. It would not be brought down because they were more distant. These areas were difficult to properly colonize and to garrison, to maintain militarily. And exactly because of the continuous resistance. And so, this is also how certain areas of Europe shaped themselves. I don't know, the Slovakians received, even when they were under the Hungarians, namely, an important Frankish influence in military culture, in weapons, etc. The same can be said, I don't know, for the Serbs, that do not just have a strong Byzantine influence, but also actually a Russian one, a Russian one, that is probably coming from the Danube through from the Black Sea through the Danube, that for some reason also differentiates, interestingly enough, in the late Middle Ages, the Serbian panoply from, say, the one of the Croats. They're literally the same people, but one is more like Western looking and the other is like more Eastern looking. Again, these things matter historically. But coming back to our early Middle Ages, the Slavs lived in villages scattered in wide plains with this loosely hegemonic capacity by some oligarch to gradually build up a seigneury, a lordship over some of these communities that, however, retained an important degree of egalitarianism in a way, because they were more socially stratified, so it was more difficult for the elite to rise above them, not for other reasons. And in fact, the elite was always very quick to imitate whichever model was out there, including de-Christianization, the ecclesiastical elite's infrastructure, the imperial ideas, the feudal system, right? So that gradually they would be invested by them as well. And naturally, until they didn't structure themselves like that, the Slavs would pay for all what comes from the fragile political systems of the tribal structure that were very often anarchically perturbed, and that's why it took them a long time before even creating proper kingdoms as opposed to Western Europe, and why also these kingdoms historically, also in the full Middle Ages, would actually didn't make it to centralize like in the West. They would become elective monarchies because the oligarchies privatistically retained more power than the king had. And we made multiple videos about the topic. It's quite interesting, as a matter of fact, because paradoxically, whenever they managed to become kingdoms, they were, as most people that kind of arrived later in this kind of more, they have greater potential because they are not like, I don't know, in feudal Western Europe, troubled by the pre-existing feudal, say, the entrenchment of feudal prerogatives of noblemen that have already created kind of mini states on their own within that. They are still, also their nobility is kind of unruly, but it's still also not very endowed with particular powers, much as the monarch doesn't. Right? So, and there are interesting features that remain later on. I had the fortune of writing a master thesis about the Battle of Markfield, 1278. It was quite late. And I will probably make a series about this. And what struck me always is that, the Battle of Markfield was fought between Rudolf of Habsburg and Ladislas the Fourth of Hungary against Ottokar II of Bohemia. So this is a showdown, right? The Habsburgs and the Arpads versus the Przemyslids, and that's the battle through which the Habsburgs managed to consolidate their presence in Austria historically. And it's a big deal because Ottokar was the most powerful, as king of Bohemia, most powerful prince in the empire. Right, he was about to, not really to take over the entire Central Europe, but still to emerge as a massive, bloc, right? Occupying, in fact, was at that point was the same Austria, etc. Now, what is fascinating, we'll talk about that, is to confront these three peoples in their historiography. Like the Germans, first of all, are completely feudalized and completely Romanized. That for them, Rudolf of Habsburg is the king of the Romans, right? So that's an imperial power, Rome, full Catholicism, feudalism, the Mendicant orders write the stories. It's all like the full standard Western pack, right? The Hungarians are not purveyed, meaning that their historiographical production is there is actually even a beautiful source there, but it's completely crazy, right? It's a complete it's interesting. It says also historical things that make sense historical, but it's this mix of stuff that makes the Hungarians mix with the Huns, like this stuff. Just, you understand, they were trying to put together kind of a presentable view of themselves, because in many ways, still by the 13th century, they were the the steppes overlords, right? Doesn't matter how feudalized. I mean, Ladislas IV was also a Cuman, half Cuman at least. His mother was a Cuman princess, and in fact, most of the Magyar contingent, the Hungarian contingent, was made up of Cumans rather than Hungarian knights. That's another story. And so you see there the wildness of the steppes. And what is beautiful instead is there is a letter that Ottokar II writes to the Poles that also participate together with the Bohemians to the battle, and probably some flee or some are killed also in the defeat. And Ottokar tells something to the Poles, that is, watch the Germans, because these are hungry wolves that want to eat you alive, because at that point, had Bohemia been crushed as it happened, eventually the Habsburgs even accepted the Polish crown. It was a complicated thing. Also, Ottokar was involved in Polish affairs, as always the Bohemians were. As you know, Königsberg, today's Kaliningrad, also took the name after the König, is the King Ottokar, because he made crusades there. I mean, that's kind of the horizon. And there is something that in this letter, with talking to other Slavs like the Poles, the Bohemian writes, stressing, like, it doesn't talk about the feudal hierarchy, it doesn't talk about this kind of juridical sophistication of the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs do also in the imperial milieu and tradition. Ottokar talks to the Poles and says, we have to fight against the Germans because of our common ancestors. This is something that the Slavs, still kind of, Bohemia was very westernized, but it was even very Germanized at the time. It was closer to civilization. It had been framed, as you know, properly from an institutional point of view in the Holy Roman Empire, which the Poles didn't, and of which they were very proud, because once they answered the emperor, you have to answer the Pope. We don't answer, we answer only God as Polish kings. Beautiful. This is the kind of mindset that you really have to study when you study history. But this thing of the ancestors, this clanic, almost probably this idea of the stock of the old, this is something that leaves into the Slavic culture and tradition. It's primitive, it's brutal, but it's wild. And you understand that because, again, this people, so if you visit these countries, their histories, etc., you understand, for example, how much emphasis they put on the idea of martyrdom, on the idea of bloodshed. This is not just, in the Balkans, because eventually they fought against the Ottomans, the Serbians crushed at Kosovo, etc. Visit Poland as well. Poland had a harsh history in recent times, but this art is medieval, and yes, they didn't have an easy time at the time as well, but you understand there that flows a pre-existing kind of ethnic, cultural semantic of some sort, from which you see these Christ statues covered in blood, right? In the West, you have, Giotto that represents, yes, the suffering, the sadness, but it's not that crudity after all. You see there the blood, you see the wounds, you see properly the drops spilling out. And you understand how bloody that mindset was, how dark in some ways these words were, and we understand them because, say, during the migration era, if you saw the Germans before they settled in the Roman, or as soon as they settled in the Roman lands, you see their art was nightmarish. That somebody with psychiatric trauma does. You see these heroes, this man dismembered by universal snakes that eat them alive. I mean, these kind of things that tell you what the hell. This is the core values that these people have in mind. You can barely understand how it actually meant to live in the Barbaricum, in Central Europe, in places like those. And this is what you must always think and exclusively think when you study history. Because if you don't try even to get close to the mindset of the people you're studying, if you make a moral point, a spiritual point, an ideal point, don't study history. It's completely useless. You will not understand anything. I know people that studied history for a lifetime and never got into these things. Factually, they don't know anything about history. They just just know the dates, the names, the events, but they factually don't understand them because they are completely deprived of any meaning. Humanity is meaning. It's literally the verbum. So, naturally, to to gestate these kind of dark side, nomadic steppe peoples of Asiatic origin, such as the Bulgars and the Avars, didn't really help, the Slavs, in fact, to have kind of a brighter view of the world. Because, of course, imagine, again, living in this relatively, in fact, fragile and unstable systems, and having, again, these waves coming literally of ferocious conquerors coming from nowhere, literally dictating law to you and deporting you, obliging them to serve them, to bring. Of course, the Slavic elites would do what, I don't know, they had done also under the Huns, the same Germans had done under the Huns or under the Romans. They would be co-opted, they would see that also as an opportunity to gain more power individual. In fact, probably the Bulgars and the Avars did help in the same way, as later on the Mongols impacted dramatically the political models of Eastern Europe, right? Russian autocracy is fundamentally a Mongol thing, right? It didn't exist before among especially the Eastern Slavs. Yes, they had some kind of it, but they were much more egalitarian, right? Middle classes were much more important. After the Mongol invasion, the Rus is turned into like a privatistic, militaristic, and almost anti-people, racially discriminatory, ultra-oligarchic thing, just like the Mongols, right? The Muscovy emerges as it was the last of the Rus in terms of power, of origins, etc. But they emerge exactly because they're the most obedient servants of the Mongols. And so you understand very much also where certain backgrounds really come from. But they were brutal, right? So they try to make things work in nightmarish realities. So the Bulgars and the Avars share this Turkic background. You know that by the 6th, the 7th century, the Turks are taking over the steppes, right? That before had remained mostly an Indo-European thing. In some cases would also remain. And in fact, among the Avars, and especially the Bulgars, there were probably important Indo-European elements. I mean, if you look at certain Bulgar stellate stones of the first generations of the migration in Thrace, in the lower Danube, you find Indo-European languages often among, because again the steppes were still kind of in turmoil and blending the two elements with an important relevance of still the Indo-European element. And I made a video about the first Bulgarian Empire, and so I can make other videos about the Bulgars if you want for the few we know at least. So as we've seen, the Bulgars and the Avars since the 6th century exercised their military hegemony on great part of the southern Slavs, and together with them they participated to the incursions and the first settlements south of the Danube, that is to say in Roman territory. Probably the Slavs that settled there, in fact, were something in between, like maybe they had arrived there as, I don't know, because they had participated properly from a military point of view to the Avar expeditions. 626, as you know, Constantinople was besieged by this coalition. But some are maybe literally escaping, a bit like the Germans had done with the Huns before, and some remained under them, some escaped. And in fact, as we were saying before, the southernmost Slavs are the ones that factually eventually melt into the mostly Greek majority, especially if you look at, I don't know, the Peloponnese. There's still a relevant Slavic element, something like around 10%, probably, maybe something less, but the majority is Greek, right? The northern you go, the greater the Slavic majority. And so that's, again, why eventually also the modern nationality is shaped with homogeneously either in one way or another. But again, the background is, like, if you visit Greece, we see a lot of types, but some Greeks look unequivocally Slav by at least the typical Slavic traits that you can think, and they're perfectly Greek. So this is, but even in Turkey you find such things. So that's normal and obvious for whichever country you visit to find such variation. Now, what I wanted to say about the military hegemony. Yes, of course, that this hegemony is also boundless in a way. And again, we're concerned with the Balkans because they're better documented, but also in Central Europe, right north of the Pannonian Plain, as you were saying before, those white Serbs, the Sorabs, the white Croats, well, those surely were under some kind of Avar control. They probably broke themselves free from it. Say, screw you, I'll pass from the other side. Also because, south of the Danube, not just they sided with the Romans, but it's also kind of better lands than the ones up here. They wouldn't move otherwise. But again, there was probably also much larger autonomy of the Slavic migrations towards the south, aside from the Bulgar and Avar hegemony, right? Again, just on average, there is, like, the stronger powers were definitely the Bulgars and the Avars, right? And the Bulgars actually increase and surpass the Avars in power, right? And they manage properly, in fact, to overrun any other entity there, like the seven Slavic clans, the Savarians. These were the Slavs that were in Bulgarian Thrace when the Bulgars arrived, and that factually supported the Bulgar elite. Well, today you still have the country of Bulgaria there. They do not have any other Slavic reality around, practically. But in fact, the Bulgars cannot subject. The only one that there is Serbia in the west, because the Bulgars do not manage to subdue completely the Serbs. They are in the western end of the Balkans. They entrench themselves in their mountains. They resist, and centuries after, we have a Serbia. The same goes for Croatia, that also actually stopped in arms. We've seen it, the video we made on the Duchy of Croatia. The same Bulgars of Simeon the First, which is a big deal, also militarily speaking. And of course, at that point, the Bulgar capacities were stretched towards the northwest and logistically, etc. So, again, that's why also that political geography in Europe exists to this day. And in particular, it was after the Avar expansion that at the end of the 6th century, the Slavs, however, settled in remarkable groups up to the Eastern Alps that had actually already been sporadically reached. The Slovenians, the actual today's Slovenians derived from those migrations, entering thus in various contrast and relation with the Bavars, the Longobards, and the Franks. And in the south, penetrating in those same decades, in fact, up to the Peloponnese, and it was still, yet again, under our hegemony, that the Slavs of the first half of the 7th century consolidated also north of the high and middle Danube in Bohemia, Moravia, and the neighboring regions. That, as we were saying before, had also capacity of breaking free. Probably that Prague culture artifacts that we find up to Thessaloniki, exactly in the date in which we are told by the Administrando Imperi of Constantine VII. Parallel, in fact, the Serbian settlement from Central Europe into the Balkans, convalidating that Sorb origin fundamentally. And these are the same times in which also the first territorial domination of essentially Bohemia and Moravia, in fact around which the so-called Prague culture gravitated, that started, right? It existed only for some decade, choosing as king, by the way, a trader of Frankish origin named Samo, famously enough, and after his death, coming back under the Avar dominion. Now, the kingdom of Samo is interesting. I will probably make a video on that maybe soon, because it shows some characters that we are in the 7th century, like you will find much later on in those places. Not just this intermitting, this is particularly interesting about Bohemia and Moravia, this kind of further expansion that would occur also with the Great Moravia. Eventually there is the premise that will properly consolidate a principality and something more solid, right? But properly this area that was well put, right? It was well delimited by the mountains, by the forests. It had mineral resources, so they were close to the Hungarians, and they will always, Bohemians and Hungarians would always make war in the same areas, right? And also always with the Germans in between. So the Battle of Markfield in 1278 is exactly the same thing, because exactly the same places where all the military history between these peoples was carried out was always the same places. Beautiful places, by the way, naturalistically, mostly, because yes, there is something historical too, but they also, as a frontier area themselves, when kind of depopulated in between them, the three of them. But it's also probably the idea of an elective foreign monarch that strikes here. Samo was a Frankish merchant, so adventurer, as you can imagine, slave trader, kind of, he surely had his retinue or something. The guy manages to, probably thanks to his wealth and prestige, to convince, also to put together this coalition that manages to shake off the Avar yoke from these Slavic peoples. Also, Samo is credited for having had, I don't know, hundreds of children, which you would think, is, just anecdotal, but it's not really so, because, you see, in a reality where everybody wasn't really, it was not really a center, even blood relations, remember the ancestors before, could help centralizing. That's why, in fact, these ties were appreciated, because at least, yes, the same Franks were not really the model, the best model of, let's say, blood ties, preventing from political disruption, but in a way, still, for if there is nothing better, at least the idea that there is a dynasty of some sort, right? Even if here was a loose thing, and again, it lasted just as long as Samo lived. But we probably we don't know about that, but probably all those children at some point shared something, right? Not just being sons of the same father. Probably had some status, probably had some, they felt close. They felt that similarity, that in absence of anything, even the biological one can in fact strengthen, importantly. But as you see, the Avars, that time, are still strong. They manage to restore their dominion over the area, which is, again, still somewhat loose. What does it mean to live next to Avars? Well, you wouldn't like to live next to the Avars, but let's put it in this way. But the idea is that aside from some raid and stolen chattel and burned farms and raped wives and daughters, etc., the idea is also that you can prevent that if you just pay a tribute, and you don't have to make that happen quite literally, up to, in fact, the point in which you can't take it anymore, and you will also stand your ground. So that the Avars are also watchful, because, as we were saying before, it's not prudent to venture outside of the steppes more than much, especially in the forest, especially in those areas that you can't really enter more easily. It's a pity though, because the river, like the valleys with rivers, trade centers, etc., are obviously the most, the areas where most wealth is accumulated because of trade reasons, etc. So it's always, again, pretty unstable reality, a tit-for-tat policy and strategy. And at the end of the day, the Avar Khaganate would collapse anyway. But at least for the Western Slavs, those weren't particularly good news, because it was the Franks now they had to cope with. And that relation would have been probably even more intense. But as far as the early medieval background is concerned, well, definitely this Avar influence, and the later Magyar one as well, for the Western Slavs, not just for the southern ones, is really remarkable, and is probably underappreciated. But again, they were violent, brutal times, and we kind of want to make this path kind of like towards civilization, but it costed a lot, right? And most of what you see civilization is the product of somebody being exterminated and trying to put a patch on it in some way so that it doesn't have to happen, at least by the same scale before, right? But again, if nobody had put that patch, or didn't have a reason for doing it, it wouldn't exist. So this is the dark morals that I leave you today with. We'll keep talking about this context. It's an accident that today I talk about, again, the Slavs, the Bulgars, and the Avars, as a matter of fact, because it just came out randomly from my book list, and it's just a coincidence that I was talking about these topics also in the recent days. In any case, as you know, we always come back on them because there's always a new perspective, there is always something important to know about them. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.